Greetings, my name is Neil Shelley. Today we're going to be working on the Model ES3 from Blendtec on how to troubleshoot and repair it. To start with, let's cover some of the basic tools you're going to need. So here is an Allen wrench. This is a 3/8 of an inch size or 9 millimeter. A standard flathead screwdriver, a pair of needle nose pliers, an adjustable wrench or a socket wrench, 1/4 inch, and a powered screwdriver or also a number 2 Phillips screwdriver, either one. Now what we're going to cover today is the Model ES3, which you see here as Easy Blender, but is also our Express, our HPA, and our Total Blender. The repair is the same for all of them. They're all base model ES3. To start with, you turn the machine over. There are 2 screw holes here, and these need to be loosened first. Next, you have 4 locking tabs in these locations that you need to open up. It can be done very simply with the thumb, and then carefully pry the base plate off. Now it will be tight here at the cord interface, so pull that carefully. Notice the 2 screws are still in the base plate. Leave them in there, set that aside. You won't need it. All right, inside the machine to start with, what you have is the paper baffle. This directs airflow and helps keep the motor cool. You have the motor itself, the inductor, which as a raw part is this piece. Now what the inductor does is senses the movement of the fan and gives feedback to the control board here on the speed of the motor to either speed it up or slow it down. This is also the locked rotor mechanism, so if for some reason the armature seizes or the jar, this will sense that and shut the machine down before anything catastrophic happens. All right. Basics of repair are to remove everything very carefully and then put it back in. So what we're going to do is start by very carefully pulling out this paper baffle. Set that aside for later use. With the paper off, you can see the filter here on the side. Now this filter is for EMF, and it is standard on every ES3 model regardless of voltage. So everyone's going to have that, all right? To start with, you'll need to remove the fan nut, washer, and spacer. We're going to put our Allen wrench into the socket opening, brace that with our hand, and we're going to use a wrench or a socket wrench to loosen the nut. Now typically these are left-handed. They are opposite of what you would normally do. As you can see, this is a left, well, this one's set it aside. Underneath is a washer. Take that off. Once you have the fan nut and washer off, you can leave the socket, the Allen wrench in the socket, and very carefully pry up on the fan on one side. And be very careful because these edges can be sharp. So use caution. Again, if the fan is tight, carefully use your needle nose pliers. Try not to deform the fan so that you can reuse it later, and take it off. Now underneath you'll see we have our fan spacer. This should come out very easily with either fingernails or, again, needle nose pliers. Okay, be sure to set all of your parts aside and don't lose them. Once you have the fan assembly off, you can very carefully place your screwdriver in and pop out the inductor. There we go. Okay, now there are 2 screw holes on the side of the machine that allow for the removal of the field, the bracket, and the brushes, and eventually the armature. In order to do that first, we're going to need to pull the electronics board out. The electronics board is simply resting in there on two tabs at the bottom. Pull it forward and then pull it up. Now inside the machine, and I'll demonstrate on this board, inside the machine you have the touchpad jack. In order to loosen the jack, to allow the touchpad to come out, you pull up on the sides in order to open it. As you push down, it locks on the touchpad itself. Now there's not a whole lot of hand room inside of the ES3, so you're going to need to be very careful putting your hands in to open that touchpad jack. It can be a difficult thing to capture on camera. We'll do our best. Come down in through the sides. Pull the board up, and if possible, use one hand to pry that open. Okay. Now what we've got is an electronics board that's free of the housing, but still connected to all of the wires. So simply pull these off, and we'll cover reconnecting them here shortly. These are all quick connects, so they pull off relatively easy. Pull straight, don't twist. You may break the post on the board. Just a nice, straight, steady force should take it off. All right, now you can see the board is free of the housing. You can set that aside. We'll come back to that later. We're now ready to loosen up the two screw holes here in the top. We've got this free to the point where we can loosen these two screws to remove the bracket, the brushes, and the field. Now leave these wire connectors here in. That way you can take the whole thing off as one assembly. Now we're going to loosen the motor itself. Again, these two screw holes, either a hand screwdriver or a powered screwdriver, whichever is most convenient for you. The screws are not exceedingly tight in the machine. You can do this by hand, no problem. We're going to loosen those up. Move on to the next. Now the screw heads on the model ES3 differ, or the screws themselves differ on ES3 from the ICB series, which you may already be familiar with, in that they actually screw into plastic, so the threads engage a little deeper than in the ICB. So as you can see, I've got the heads all the way up to the top. They should now be completely loosened. So we can pull this whole assembly out. To do that, you're going to go in with your hands, and you're going to put your thumb, both thumbs over the shaft, and pry this up very carefully so you can get it as a full assembly. And again, the space inside of an ES3 is fairly limited. All right, now as you can see, we've got some ground wires attached. All right, one goes to the filter, one to the cord, and one to the field. If you don't need to change the field, leave it as an assembly. If you need to change the brushes, leave it as an assembly. There's no reason to take this apart and redo it unless you absolutely have to. Okay, so we're going to set that aside. Now as you can see, I have now worked my inductor free. So the speed sensor is loose. I'm going to set that aside. Don't lose it. The only connections remaining inside the board are the power cord to the filter and the filter to the ground wires. All right. So if you need to change the filter, it's adhered simply with foam tape, double sticky. Pry it off, replace it. Make sure the connections are exactly the same as you reconnect it, otherwise it will explode. Gives you very much a better jolt than coffee ever will. Okay? I'm not going to pry this one off, but trust me. Okay, to take the armature out, what we're going to do, let me switch cord sides. You're going to take your Allen wrench again, stick it into the socket, And if you did need to replace the armature, you would simply slam this down as hard as you can and the armature will pop out. This will preserve the sling ring here, which you can use at a later time. So this will come off and be on your Allen wrench. Now when you have the socket out, or the armature out, this is what it will look like. You have bearings on both ends, the drive socket here, this is the armature itself, and there will be a rubber cup that sits over this. The rubber cup will more than likely stay in the housing. You can fish it out with your finger or you can leave it in. Personally, I recommend taking the cup out so that you can ensure it's sitting in around this bearing correctly. Okay? Now this is the new style socket. Some of our older style it's a little thicker and it's screwed on. This is our newer style. It shrinks on. It cannot be removed, it cannot be replaced, and therefore these bearings cannot be replaced. If you have a bearing failure or you have some kind of problem with the armature, you're going to replace the entire assembly, not any kind of componentry. Same with the electronics board. You have any kind of electronics problem, you're going to change the board as a whole. Do not try to replace any kind of componentry on here. These boards are conformal-coated. There is a level of silicone essentially that's on top, prevents you from getting down to the actual component itself. So electronic problem, you're going to replace the whole board. Now to reassemble, you would place the armature assembly into the housing, and you're going to want to make sure that the bearing cup is seated, the black cup that goes around. Make sure that's seated all the way down. Once you've got it in, simply grab that shaft and spin it. Make sure that whole armature assembly spins freely. If it doesn't, reevaluate how it's sitting, make sure it's fully engaged. At this point, you're going to put your armature aside and get your field back, and we're going to put the field back on. Now, notice I have the front of the machine away from me. This is contrary to how we work on an ICB. On an ICB, the front of the machine is always towards you. Okay, just minor differences, but helpful to know. Tuck your field back in. Make sure your ground wires are where they're supposed to be. And we are going to place this assembly back onto the motor. This is our thermal sensor. You can see it's tucked into the bottom of the field. This will sense an over temp condition. If your display reads over temp, then this has exceeded the allowable temperature of the motor. If it hits that point, you unplug the machine and let it rest for at least 20 minutes. Okay, this will kick on at 90 degrees centigrade. It's very hot. So you're not going to take the machine apart at that point. Leave it and let it cool. Okay? Separate your wires. Carefully set your armature, your field assembly back onto the motor here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to get this to the point where the brushes are resting on top of the shaft of the armature. Okay? I've left the brushes in, or maybe I've replaced the brushes. This allows you to pry the brushes back and work this assembly back down onto the armature. Okay? It's very simple to do with a screwdriver. You come in here and you just pry these brushes apart and step them down over the armature assembly. Okay? You want to be very careful as you get closer to the commutator, the copper part of the this part here. This is called the commutator. You want to be very careful. If you scratch that, you'll get a lot of sparking and arcing, and it could compromise how the machine runs. So as you get down here a little ways, just use some caution. All right, so as I'm getting down, I'm just going to go really slow. And I'm applying a constant downward pressure with my hand so that as I pry that back, it's able to slip down into position. Now I've got it down pretty much where it needs to go. So at this point, what I'm going to do is make sure all of my wire connectors are out where I can see them to make sure nothing is pinched or under the field or between the field and the bracket. If you have that kind of situation, it's going to pinch the wire, it's going to cut the insulation, you'll get a dead short, and the machine will essentially be non-functional. All right, so final adjustments on getting this down in. Just getting it to seat on that top bearing. Gonna kind of push it down, wiggle it, make sure it's in position. All right, so here, once we've got it down, you can see underneath we've got a thrust washer, and this allows the armature assembly to float within the entire motor assembly. Underneath that is a grounding ring. It's unique to the model ES3. There is not one in the ICB series. And that ring grounds the whole armature assembly to the common ground of the power cord. All right, very important that those are both still in there. Okay, so once this is in position, we can tighten the screws back down. Again, you can do this by hand. You can use a power driver. The key is to not over-tighten them. If you over-tighten them, you're going to crack the bracket or you're going to crack the housing, and then you're into a complete and total rebuild. Now, it doesn't matter. You don't have to torque these down to a certain specification. You can tighten one down all the way and then tighten the other down all the way. There are locating tabs in the bottom of the machine that hold the field into position, so there's no worries there. So nice and tight, but again, don't over muscle it. You want to make sure it's tight, but not to the point where it's going to crack or break. If you have a power driver, make sure you have it on a torque setting so it won't strip anything. All right, so we have the motor back into position. We have all of our wires free and loose. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to reinstall our board connections. So I want you to watch this very closely. You have two black wires. They may be black and white, they may be white and white. Depends on the manufacturer when they're making the field. These are coming from the field. They hook up onto the board, and it is not important at all which one they go to. And they will be labeled as motor A and motor B. Again, either wire can go to either one. Doesn't matter. Just push them on nice and simple, very carefully. Try not to flex the board in your hand. Don't bend it, otherwise you may crack a component. So I'm just pushing these on. So there's motor A and there's motor B. Just seat them all the way down. Then you have a white wire and a black wire coming from the power cord or from the filter. The white wire is neutral, the black wire is line, and the board itself is labeled. You have this one is labeled neutral, and over here it is labeled line. These colors on these cords may change depending on the voltage. It should be either white or blue for neutral, and then brown or black for line. So we're going to slide those on, nice and easy. Make sure they're all the way down. Now I'm going to flip the board over because I want to show you these connections here. Now there are three connectors, 2 or 3 pin, one is 2 pin. The 2 pin is for your thermal sensor, and so we're going to go ahead and put that on. And then one of the 3 pins is for your inductor. It'll be this one here labeled motor sensor, not this one here labeled Hall sensor. The Hall sensor is a interlock feature that's not available on this model yet, so make sure it's hooked up here to the motor sensor. There's only one way to put them on. You can't put them on backwards without trying really hard. If you put them on backwards, it's not going to work right. All right, so I'm turning the board back over. We've got the display. So the touchpad jack is closed. I'm going to lift up on the sides to open it. We want it open as we go in. Now in the bottom of the housing are 2 slots that the board's going to rest in here. We're going to put it in, and then we're going to put the touchpad in. The touchpad's the tricky part. You're going to come in with the fingers, you're going to grab the touchpad jack, push it in, and then close it in one motion. It's a technique. It's a little hard to do at first, but you can get it in time. Be patient with it. If you have large hands, this is even more difficult than it looks. So we're going to put that in, make sure it's seated in the tabs, I'm going to move some wires out of my way. In fact, one of the things you can do is move your wires out of the way, put your board down in, and then come in from the sides and put your touchpad jack in. Now sometimes the edges here can be a little sharp. You want to be very cautious. If these do feel sharp to you, take a little bit of sandpaper or emery cloth and dull them down so you don't cut your hands up as you're doing this. Okay? So what I'm going to do is come in down here to the touchpad jack and the touchpad, bend it over, push it in, and close it so that we can close the machine up and finish it up. Okay? So once the touchpad jack is installed, you're going to want to push your wires down around the motor, get them out of the way. The only wire we don't have connected right now is our magnetic sensor or speed sensor. It's connected to the board but not to the motor yet. We're going to wait and put our fan and everything back on and then put this on. Now at this point, if you had taken the armature out, what you would do is get a block of wood, rest the armature shaft on the block of wood so it would sit like this. You're going to take your sling ring and gently set it on top of here, and then you would put it back on with the hammer. And it's simple taps. You don't have to slam it, okay? Just nice and easy until it's flush with the top of the socket, all right? But you do need to make sure that shaft is supported by a block of wood or something that will give, because it actually sits lower than these feet. So you will need something here, all right? A piece of wood is fine. Now, we're going to put our fan back on. Here we have our fan spacer. You have a narrow end and a wide end. The wide end is always up, all right? So we're going to just slide that on, okay? Now our fan, there's a marking on this fan. I don't know if you'll be able to see it in the camera, but it's a small L, all right, for left hand. The left hand, this marking is always facing up when you're working this way. Don't turn it this way, it won't cool effectively. Always make sure this mark is up. So what we're going to do, and I actually brought a new fan because I bent that one a little. So we're going to take the fan, we're just going to push it onto the shaft, spin it, and it will eventually rest on the spacer. Okay? Then take your washer, put your washer over, and then your nut, and you can start to thread the nut by hand until the point that the shaft starts to turn. Then you're going to put your Allen wrench back into the socket, and then use either your adjustable wrench or your socket wrench to tighten that nut down. Now again, you don't have to tighten this tremendously tight. Hand tight is sufficient. The motor itself is run in such a way that it will tighten over time. Okay? So now we've got that back on. We can now take our speed sensor. Now, on the speed sensor you have a flat side and you have a side that's curved. The curved side will match the curve here of the bracket. So you'll set it in and carefully push it down till it clicks. Once it clicks, it's in position, you're done. It should be flush with the top and flush here with the curvature. If it's anything other, remove it and do it again. All right, finally, we're going to put our paper baffling back on. As you can see, there's a cutout on one side for the speed sensor we just installed. You have two tabs here on each side that lock under these tabs. And we're just going to put this on. You've got a small notch here for the power cord because this will lay down. All right. There are already holes through it to line up for the screw holes. So we've got that in position. Your wires are underneath. Very nice and easy. So now we're going to put our base plate back on. We're just going to set it into place and then push down. Now you may need to come down inside and push the board gently back to get it to fall into, let me show you these slots. There's 2 slots here that the board engage in. All right, so as you're putting this base plate back on, you want your board to be back a little bit to make sure they actually do engage into those locking tabs. Okay, so we're going to push it down, lock it, lock it, lock it. This end one here where the cord at might be the tight end, but you're going to push and you can wiggle the cord up and down to get it to seat into this restraint here. All right, so we've got that now into position. There may be a little gap here back. You can see there's a bit of a gap right there. That will go away in time as this closes in over that power cord and restrains it into position. So don't be too worried about that. So now we need to tighten our screws back up. We're going to take our power driver and tighten it up. Okay? So now we're back to good as new. All right. Now, a couple of other things to cover. If you needed to replace the touchpad, you're going to take a flathead screwdriver, probably a little smaller than this, and you're going to pry up on one of these corners. Now this whole assembly can then be peeled off of the unit itself. The ribbon should come out as well. You can slide a new one in that's adhesive on the bottom, slide it in, and then reconnect inside just as we've already done. Now the overlay here, this part that you see, is different for each model. So the Express one may be different than here. The ES3 is different than the Total Blender. All right. You can order the correct overlay and put it on at any time that you want. Okay. Same with the display label here. You can pull this off and replace it very easily with a screwdriver, and they can be ordered at any time. Blendtec strongly recommends and provides a total rebuild kit for the model ES3. Now this kit includes an armature assembly, electronic assembly with microchip, speed sensor, fan, display label, touchpad, and touchpad overlay. When you use the total rebuild kit, it's like making a brand new machine. It's going to last longer and your customers are going to be happier with it. Now, all parts for the Blendtec ES3 can be purchased at any time except this base plate. The base plate will have a serial number label on it and therefore cannot be purchased. However, all other parts can be purchased at any time directly from Blendtec.